So this workshop is meant to be very active for you. The main thing we plan to do is to spend a lot of time drawing, or as much time as we can drawing. And we want to do a lot of drawings. And we're going to do that by reading instructions. So I'm going to be placing sometimes long instructions on the screen. And sort of the game of the workshop is to interpret the instructions into pictures. And sometimes that'll be confusing, sometimes that'll be difficult, but that's really sort of the joy or the pleasure or the game of the workshop. There's no right or wrong. It's really just a matter of interpreting those instructions into pictures in the way that you want to. It's a lot about interpretation and a lot about the ambiguity of language. Code languages are very unambiguous, they're very clear, but natural languages, English and Turkish, they're filled with ambiguity. And a little bit of what we're going to be talking about is the difference between natural languages and machine languages, but also in general just how to bring pictures into the world, how to draw based on a series of ideas and a series of instructions and a series of systems. It's in a way a framework for image making. I guess just to repeat, the idea is to really get into a space of drawing, to think about the marks that you're making, to think about the images that you're producing. It's not about finishing or completing the instructions, it's really about the experience of making images together. And this is a big group to do a drawing workshop, and I think it's going to be chaotic. And as long as we sort of embrace the fact that we're in this together and it's going to be a bit chaotic, I think we can have a lot of fun. I think the thing to do is to find a place for yourself in this room where you're comfortable. We can move a few more chairs out of the way. Feel free to be up here. Feel free to be anywhere. But just find a space where you're comfortable and where you can make images. And in making these drawings, we're going to start with quick ones. We're going to do some of the same drawings twice, and then we're going to work our way up to ones that are a little more involved, have more logic to them. And then in between, I'm going to invite you to move around and to see what other people are doing, how other people are interpreting the instructions, and this will take a little bit less than 1 hour total. Does anybody have any questions or concerns before we get going? Okay, we'll jump in. This is just a summary of what I just said, a little bit more concisely. Another interesting thing about the workshop today is that all the instructions will be in Turkish, and I think you can tell I don't understand or speak Turkish, and so you're at the advantage for what the instructions say to me, so we're flipping things around. This is the first set of instructions. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do it, it's just about interpreting how you want to do it. Please find a space where you're comfortable, and we'll just proceed from there. And the first one will be a 2-minute drawing. So just 2 minutes. Oh, wait, one more super important thing. I'm sorry. You have your paper. Please just fold it this way. And then just so that we don't produce a lot of waste, do the first drawing on one half of the paper, and then we'll do the next iteration of this drawing on the other half of the paper. So 2 minutes, go ahead and start. And if you're comfortable at the seats, please do that, but if you want to spread out and use the floor or the stage, please just go where you want to be. Okay, great. That was a bit longer than 2 minutes, but I hope you enjoyed that. What I want to do now is just ask you to stand up, put your drawings where you are, and just move around for about 1 minute and look what everybody has done. And while you're doing that, just think about the way that you made an interpretation of the instructions and see what other people have done. I think one interesting question is, what part of your drawing do you feel is essential to the instructions, and what part of your drawing do you feel is more you? Like, where are you asserting your authorship over the drawing, and where do you think the instructions are defining what you're doing? Okay, so please find your way back to where you are. And we're going to do one more round of this drawing, based on the idea of, like, what have you seen that other people have been doing that you might want to incorporate into your what you're doing. This style of meshes for a long time was really, and often still is, the foundation of computer graphics. Almost every model that you see in a special effects movie or a video game is made of these meshes made out of triangles, made out of geometry. So anything from a dragon to a car to a human, typically when you see things in a game environment or a software environment, are made out of these same shapes. Most of you chose to make things that were more abstract, more network-based. It's also possible through these kinds of shapes and these instructions to make something different than that. All right, so based on what you saw and what you want to do, let's do another really quick 2-minute drawing on the other side of the same sheet of paper. Or not the other side, but the other page. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to start actually timing things to make sure we get through what we need to get through. Same instructions, yes. But the idea is, with the same instructions, how can you make a different drawing, but they still come from the same set of rules? Mm-hmm. Other things to think about are the speed and the sort of the quality of the line that you're drawing. Do you want to make quick strokes to have that kind of gesture or that kind of energy? Do you want to make very slow and accurate marks? I saw a number of people doing stippling or doing lines with dots, sort of transforming the texture or the quality of the line. And then another thing we have to think about today is really the color and how that color expresses the line, and how do you use colors together within your drawing to express what you want to express or the idea that you want to put forward with it. So please just don't stand up this time just for time's sake, but look around at what people have done around you and see if there's things that are curious, things to be considered. So that was the most rigid drawing. We're going to move to the next one now, and this is going to be a little bit longer drawing. This is a 4-minute drawing. So let's go for it. Time starting now. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think the best thing to do is just to turn around the page that you've been working on. So like use the same one, but the 2 blank places left. And of course, there's a lot of paper. So if you want to have a new sheet, it's back in the corner where you picked up the first ones. Okay. Please stand and go look at what other people have done. There's some really nice drawings in the room. And as you're looking, think about what you've done, think about what other people have done, and again, a similar question. What part of the drawing that you made is embedded in the instructions, and what part of that drawing comes from your interpretation of the instructions? if we were in a small classroom setting together, we'd have a conversation about this that would last about 15 minutes probably, where we'd talk about things like the differences between, like the instructions don't say, well, the original instructions didn't talk about straight lines. So like wavy lines or curves, you know, of course are lines as well. So like what kinds of lines did you choose to make? Some of the drawings look very computational or mathematic. They look very rigid. And then others are far more organic in nature. Does the phrase binary tree cause you to draw in one way and not another? Some drawings are uniform. For example, all the pieces of the tree are the same length. Others have lengths that are very random, short and long, and others are progressive. So they start long and they get shorter as they go. Let's go ahead and... The what? There's no length information. Exactly. Yeah. So let's go ahead and come back. And on your last remaining page on this one sheet, let's do another tree drawing. And as you're drawing, think about what you've seen, what you want to incorporate into your drawing. And I think it's also useful to think about if this drawing were being made by some other kind of entity, maybe software, rather than your own hand, how might this drawing be different? And do you want to, in doing the second drawing, emulate a more mechanical way of doing it, or do you want to make it even more expressive or even more about the marks that you're making with your body and your hand? All right, let's go. Okay. Wonderful. There's a lot of really interesting ideas being encoded in the drawings around the room. I think some other things to think about are, the materials that we're using, the paper that we're using. We're all drawing with markers. What if we were using brushes and ink? What if we had different kinds of paper surfaces? How would those choices affect the images that we're making? What I want to do right now is think briefly about the difference between making these drawings by hand and making these drawings with code. So I want to show you a piece of code that doesn't perform this drawing exactly, but it performs a really similar drawing. So I'm going to move this over. And then, let's see here. Because I moved it over, I have to change one thing here real quick. Oh, no, that's right. Okay. Nope. So I personally, as a human in the world, I love drawing by hand. It's one of my favorite things to do. It's how I got into media art. It's how I got into coding, was through drawing. I also love drawing with code. I love making pictures and I love making images that I create through writing sets of instructions in code. So I think this is a rhetorical question. It's a question for everyone to answer, I think, for yourselves. But again, in like a smaller classroom environment, we'd have a hearty conversation about this. But what are the differences between the drawings that you were just making by hand, and what are the differences between this particular drawing made with code? And how does doing something immediately by hand allow for a certain kind of improvisation and flexibility? What does the code offer in exchange for that? And this, of course, is just one idea about how to implement a tree in code. There are as many different ideas about how to do that as there are people in the world. And an individual can, of course, do that in so many different ways. One way that this particular piece of code works is that it talks about this idea of probability, which I think is really important in this idea of thinking about code and drawing with systems. So you can see here, if you read the comments in the code there, it says there's a 98% chance that will happen, that it'll keep drawing the tree. And then there's a 2% chance that it's going to make the branches. So sort of in the way that we were making branches. And so I think in the instructions that we were reading before, we didn't have these probabilities. It was more rigid. It's like from one branch, always make two, and always make two from that. I think we'll move to the next drawing. So these first two were preparatory. So now we're going to be getting somewhere else. So I think for this one, I would use your second piece of paper or get started on that. Maybe fold it and use one of those pieces. This is a drawing of a very different quality. And it talks about flipping a coin, which is, of course, like a binary condition, one thing or the other thing. If you don't want to flip a coin or you don't have a coin, just flip coins in your head. That's a very good way to do this. Okay. I think not everybody's finished, but that's, of course, that's totally fine and good. I'd encourage you to, again, stand up and look around at what other people have done. That one is? Mm-hmm. Good. So what do you see? What are the differences in different people's drawings? And I think for me, importantly, what are the differences between these different sets of instructions? Some sets of instructions are more rigid. They don't allow for as much expression or as much difference. But there's always room for variation. I don't see any that have extremely irregular grids, like grids that are progressive or grids that have really different dimensions.
Problems with the words. I don't understand this correctly. It says ızgara is in lines in Turkish.
Mm-hmm.
1, 2, 3, 5. But everyone draw like 6 to 6. So is it squares or is it lines?
Okay. So this one, we're only going to do one drawing for, the one that we've done. I think another thing to think about is in your own way of doing things, which of these drawings have you enjoyed the most? Did you enjoy the first one the most, the second one, the third one, and why? Like, what about those drawings in the instructions? Some people really prefer to have more flexibility. Other people really like the structured quality or the rhythm or the sort of the concentration that this last exercise requires. And of course, this one scales a tremendous amount. I want to show you the source of where this one comes from. It comes from a computer program written in 1982 for a computer called the Commodore 64. So this was a time when computers were first coming into people's homes in different places around the world, and things were written in a language called BASIC. So I'm going to write a program that produces the drawing that we were just making in its own way. So I have to kind of look up to see it. So I'm going to say 10 print. So that's going to print to the screen. And I'm going to print a character. And I'm going to print a variation between character 205 and character 206. And I'm going to do that by adding a random number. So when I flip my coin, it's going to turn that first number into 205 sometimes and 206 other times. And character 205 is this line, and character 206 is that line. So the two different lines that we've been drawing. And then I'm going to make a loop. So when I say go to 10 at the end of that, it means run that line, flip the coin, and then do that again. Run that line again. And so I'm going to hit return, then I'm going to hit run, and that's our result. So I think for instructions that require less interpretation, they're easier to write as a piece of code. And instructions maybe like the tree before, sometimes they are a little more involved to encode to write a program for because they involve more decisions. I think this is the most sort of precise and the most rigorous code maybe imaginable. It's very formal, very structured. Yeah, it's not technically a maze or a labyrinth, but it's very maze and labyrinth-like. for sure. And then these are just the default colors for this computer. This is just how it looked. Okay, so we can hit escape to stop it. We can say list to look at the program again. So let's go a different direction. I think this is going to be our final drawing, and I'm really excited about it because it's a two-person drawing. So for this drawing, you find a partner, and I recommend just using the full page for this one. It's sort of our grand finale drawing. And maybe have a little bit of a discussion, read through the instructions first, discuss the instructions about how you want to proceed. I think these instructions are no more complex, but they're just a little more involved. They have multiple steps. So please enjoy, make the decisions you want to make about how to execute them. Oh yeah, with your partner you draw on the same piece of paper. Together, one sheet. And there's a lot more room on the floor in the back if you want to spread out. There's more room up here on the stage. Oh, yeah. So we're having a lot of discussions, interesting discussions about the instructions for this one. I think that maybe in the English to Turkish translation something changed that was unexpected to me, which I think is exciting. It's the whole point of things. The whole point of things is that machine languages are so exact and precise, they can only be interpreted one way. And this is the whole beauty of natural languages. I'm going to put up the English really quick so you can compare. And again, I think it's not like an error or a glitch, it's just something interesting that's happened. It may be that the English instructions were not clear either, which is really possible. But I think that the drawings that are being produced through the interpretation of the Turkish instructions are really nice drawings. Sorry, oh. Okay, wow. This has been amazing. I want to show you quickly, before we need to wrap up, a software version of these instructions. And I guess also just to summarize what the original discussion before, I believe that the instructions were confusing in English, and therefore when they were translated well into Turkish, they were also confusing. And I think that it's also, some people drew it according to the original intent. Other people interpreted it in a different way. And I just want to repeat, I think that's what's interesting about doing this kind of work. And then there's this other translation that's then later made into code. And this is done, I didn't mention this before, but it's done in a language called processing, which is a language that is made for the visual arts, for making drawing with code. And the what? It's called processing. I'll write it here. Well, like that. And well, anyway, let's say this to maybe wrap up. When you're writing code, that code always starts as an idea, and those ideas oftentimes they're fuzzy and they're vague. Oftentimes they're sketched on paper as diagrams, or just ways of thinking through what you're trying to do. And then at some point, it needs to become more concrete and more clear through the writing of the code. And so these instructions in English being vague, people having different interpretations for it, is just the nature of communicating in a language like that. But then when it does eventually become more clearly defined in code, there becomes one interpretation of that. And so this is one instance of taking those instructions and producing them in code. And so this is that last step where the lines are being drawn in between the center points of the circles. And if we look at it in a different way to look at how it's made, you can see that these are the lines that are being drawn in the background. And here the circles are just being implied. They're not actually being drawn, but the lines connecting the circles are what's visible. The circles are there. Let me draw the circles for you. So there you can see the circles and then the lines connecting the center points. And then as you're working like this, you may have I had an original plan for what it would do, but then after the code was written, there's a process of iteration and a process of refinement where things change. Like I think at the beginning I didn't expect the circles would be that jammed and packed in, but that was just the result of the process of starting and continuing to refine it and to push it in different ways. Well, they're moving because I gave them behaviors to move. So I think when we're drawing on paper, well, I think that's another difference between drawing by hand and drawing on screen, is that when we're drawing on screen, we have more opportunity to think about animation and to think about kinetics and choreography. No, not at all. Yeah, though this is an extension of those drawings, but it started there, and then it sort of evolved into this other thing. Yeah. So it's the same sketch, but it's looking at it in two different ways. So this is, I would say, the geometry or the diagram of what's happening. And then now I'm turning off the geometry. And the only thing that I'm drawing now are those lines that connect the center points, so the very last step. And there's another rule that, depending on the length of the line, they change their gray value. And so I think it's really long lines are white, and then as they go shorter, they become darker. And so that's where you get the different gray contrasts. A rendering? Sorry, I couldn't hear. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, running in real time, running live. So, I mean, just to contextualize really quickly, what we've done this morning is the way that I oftentimes start my programming classes that I teach in different longer workshops and at the university. And we oftentimes go through a lot of the basic fundamental ideas of coding, and we do that by hand and we do it through instructions. The second part of this workshop is that we're not going to do today, but you can do with your own students, or you can do for fun in a group, is to write your own instructions for making drawings and try your hand at that. And oftentimes that's an iterative approach where you write instructions, you give it to somebody else, the other person will then interpret the instructions as a drawing, and then you oftentimes go back and you correct or you modify the instructions based on what people draw from it, and it's an iterative process. And so the next step after that, typically in a classroom, is to begin drawing with code and learning the basics there. So we know how to draw a line on paper. How do you draw a line on screen? We know how to move a shape across the paper. How do you move a shape across the screen in code and that kind of thing? So it's a methodology for getting into it and beginning with what people know. People know how to draw. People know how to make marks and how to make compositions, and then how to apply that knowledge, at least in art and design school people do, and then how to apply that knowledge into this new form, into this other medium. So there we have it for today. Thank you so much for joining and coming.